Hey everybody, welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm Michael Chikeen, and today in the virtual studio, I have with me Susanna Bennett. Susie is a research fellow at the Suicidal Behavior Research Lab at the University of Glasgow. Her work focuses on exploring and understanding suicide risk and recovery factors in men. She has done studies synthesizing 20 years of male suicide research, explored help-seeking barriers for men, childhood challenges, and developed an agenda of priorities for male suicide research. Her work has been supported by thousands of men worldwide, sharing their insights and experiences. So today, we're going to dive as deep as we can into what she's found. Susie Bennett, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, giving this work a platform.
I kind of want to start at the beginning for how I guess you were influenced or inspired to go in this direction with your research on this topic. Obviously, it's very heavy. What inspired you to learn more about this?
Yeah, I mean, it was never something that I anticipated would become the sort of central preoccupation of my existence. I'm trying to understand male pain in essence, which is how I think of the work. So I worked for a long time for NGOs and charities and sort of communication and fundraising roles. And I went back to study really because I was interested in the psychology of how people form their beliefs. And I thought if you could understand those processes, then it will help, illuminate a path of how beliefs could be reshaped as well.
Right.
Because your communication work in NGOs was really about trying to get people to care about things. So I went back to study with that kind of purpose in mind, and I did a social and cultural psychology master's, and I just fell in love with studying. It was such a relief for my brain to be able to think about things deeply and not have an agenda of an organization that you're working for. And I loved it. I was euphoric. I was so happy. And then it came to do my thesis subject, and I just had this feeling, I was so in love with the learning. I just had this feeling that I had to pick a topic that I was equally in love with, that really spoke to something deep, that was a question that was critical to my own kind of navigation of life and trying to make sense of, myself and the people around me. And so this was back in 2017 when the Me Too movement was kicking off, and there was this huge sort of explosion of conversation around male privilege and male power. And at the same time in the UK, there were these statistics around suicide being the biggest killer of men under 50. So all the men that I knew under 50, the thing that was most likely to kill them was suicide. And so these two ideas of like men having all the privilege and then men dying sort of deaths of despair at such high rates, I just thought there's something in between these two poles. There's this huge missing chunk of the story that I want to understand. And at the same time, in my um, personal life, I was had loved ones who really had struggled for a long time with suicidal feelings and suicide attempts. And so, a question very central to me in my life was what can bring someone to the point where they're questioning their ability to stay in existence, and what more can we collectively do to try and anchor them in a meaningful life. And then, Michael, I couldn't have anticipated what then happened, because once I start, so that then became the topic of my thesis, trying to understand male risk and recovery factors for male suicide. And I did 32 interviews with people, with men who'd either attempted or people bereaved by male suicide. And those conversations just changed my life. It was so emotional, deeply, deeply emotional, as you can imagine. And also was just a real shedding for me, not just from that moment, but continually through my research, sort of 7 years later, just a continual shedding of how I sort of understood the world and understood gender relationships and dynamics, and understood what it's like for a lot of men to move in the world, which, but before my research, I didn't have, I was so ignorant of, even though I was deeply in relation with a lot of men. And so it's distressing for me to think about the way in which I was socialized to have such little understanding of the true kind of emotional um, experience for a lot of men. That's a very long-winded answer to say that of how I kind of landed up here. But once I started this work, Michael, it was just, I've described it in the past as like a dog picking up a scent in the woods. I just couldn't stop. I couldn't stop. I just was like, there's so much that seems invisible here. Like so many of the men I spoke to felt so deeply alone with their pain. And I found that so distressing because often they would be men that had a lot of people around them. You know, there was a potential for these huge bonds of care to be activated, and yet somehow there was this sort of miscommunication, misunderstanding. Men were allowed to become so isolated in plain sight, and yeah, I just couldn't. I couldn't stop, and now here we are in 2024.